Look at the modern technology industry, and from the outside, it appears to be a sprawling, cutthroat battlefield. Apple fighting Google, Sony fighting Microsoft, Dell fighting HP. When you walk into a brightly lit electronics store to buy a new smartphone or a laptop, you feel like you are standing at the center of endless, hyper-competitive choices. You weigh the benefits of an iPhone against a Samsung Galaxy, or debate the merits of a sleek gaming laptop versus a PlayStation console. But this entire ecosystem of fierce competition is, in many ways, an elaborate illusion. Underneath this highly publicized war for the consumer's wallet is a quiet, highly profitable, and tightly controlled peace treaty. If you were to crack open any of those devices and look closely at the green silicon of the motherboard, you would find a critical component known as DRAM, Dynamic Random Access Memory. This is the short-term working memory that allows the device to actually function. Think of a computer's solid-state storage as a massive filing cabinet, and the DRAM as the physical surface of the desk where you actually do the work. The more DRAM you have, the more applications your phone or computer can actively run simultaneously without slowing to a crawl. Without this memory, even the most advanced microchip on the planet is just a useless rock of silicon. And today, roughly 95% of all DRAM on the planet is manufactured by just 3 companies: Samsung and SK Hynix in South Korea, and Micron Technology in the United States. These 3 entities operate as a highly disciplined oligopoly. When global demand for electronics drops, they do not lower their prices to compete with one another for market share. They simply turn off their machines, restrict the global supply, and force prices back up. They are effectively the OPEC of the digital age, and whether you know it or not, you pay their invisible tax every single time you buy a piece of modern electronics. This is the story of how the global semiconductor industry consolidated from dozens of cutthroat competitors in the 1980s into a cozy, 3-headed cartel. It is a story of how these survivors built an impenetrable $20 billion moat around their businesses, how they use absolute market power to manipulate global supply, and how they are currently starving the everyday consumer electronics market to feed the multi-billion-dollar artificial intelligence boom. To understand how these 3 companies gained the power to dictate global prices, we have to go back to a time when they actually had to compete. In the 1970s and 1980s, the memory chip market was a brutal, chaotic battlefield. At its absolute peak, the global DRAM market sported 23 different, highly aggressive suppliers. Following the invention of the integrated circuit, American pioneers like Intel, Advanced Micro Devices, Motorola, and Texas Instruments dominated the early industry. In the late 1970s, American firms captured almost 90% of the market for early 4K DRAM chips. It was an era of rapid innovation, but that American dominance was not destined to last. The Japanese government recognized the strategic importance of semiconductors, viewing the silicon chip as a fundamental building block of the future economy. Backed by massive, coordinated state capital, Japanese conglomerates like Hitachi, NEC, Toshiba, and Fujitsu flooded into the memory market. They consistently achieved manufacturing yields of over 70%, whereas American manufacturers struggled to break a 50% yield. Because they threw away fewer broken chips, the Japanese conglomerates could produce DRAM drastically cheaper. By 1985, Japanese manufacturers were accused of aggressively dumping 256K DRAM chips into the United States market at prices well below the actual cost of production, causing global DRAM prices to plummet by an astonishing 70% in a single year. The American semiconductor industry was decimated. Intel famously made the existential decision to pivot away from the memory chips it had helped invent, transitioning entirely to microprocessors. Motorola bowed out. Texas Instruments eventually surrendered. Out of the bloodbath, only one American manufacturer managed to survive, a small upstart based in Boise, Idaho, named Micron Technology. But the absolute monopoly established by the Japanese was incredibly short-lived. Moving into the 1990s, the South Korean government deployed the exact same playbook, but with even more aggressive capital backing. The South Korean state-backed conglomerates poured billions of dollars into massive new memory fabrication plants. They aggressively scaled production, triggering yet another massive global price war. The 1990s and the 2000s subsequently became defined by vicious boom and bust cycles. The memory manufacturers would perpetually overinvest in massive new factories during the good times, flood the global market with chips, crash the price of the commodity, and drive the weakest players straight into bankruptcy. In 1999, following the devastating Asian financial crisis, the South Korean government forced a shotgun marriage between the semiconductor divisions of Hyundai and LG, merging them into a single entity that would eventually become SK Hynix. In Europe, Qimonda could not survive the brutal price cycles and ultimately filed for bankruptcy in 2009. In Japan, the government desperately tried to save its dying, once dominant industry by merging the struggling DRAM divisions of Hitachi, NEC, and Mitsubishi into a single state-backed national champion called Elpida Memory. Under the leadership of CEO Yukio Sakamoto, Elpida fought tooth and nail to stay alive in an increasingly concentrated market. But the global landscape was unforgiving. In 2012, amidst a crippling global recession, plummeting PC sales, and a historically strong Japanese yen that destroyed their export competitiveness, Elpida officially filed for bankruptcy with over $5.6 billion in debt. It marked the largest manufacturing bankruptcy in post-war Japanese history. Elpida's remaining factories, intellectual property, and engineering talent were scooped up for pennies on the dollar by the lone American survivor, Micron. And just like that, the music stopped. There were no more chairs left in the game. The industry had consolidated from 23 cutthroat companies down to just 3: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. Today, new competitors cannot easily enter this market because the barriers to entry have become physically, scientifically, and financially insurmountable. Building a modern, leading-edge semiconductor fabrication plant is no longer a matter of millions or even single billions. It requires a staggering upfront capital investment of $15 billion to $20 billion. The factory itself is a modern marvel of engineering, requiring $4 to $6 billion just for the physical structure, the vibration-dampening concrete waffle foundations, and the hyper-pure clean rooms. But the real cost lies in the machinery. To print the nanoscale transistors required for modern memory, fabs utilize extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography machines. These miraculous devices are manufactured exclusively by a single company on Earth, the Dutch firm ASML. Inside an EUV machine, a high-powered laser strikes microscopic droplets of molten tin falling through a vacuum, hitting them 50,000 times a second to generate extreme ultraviolet light. That light is then bounced off the flattest mirrors ever created by humanity to print patterns just a few nanometers wide. The newest generation of these tools cost an astonishing $380 million each, weigh 150,000 kilograms, and require dozens of specialized engineers, months just to assemble. Therefore, the 3 surviving companies have effectively built a $20 billion moat around their businesses. No scrappy startup in a garage can easily cross a moat made of EUV lithography machines. And once the big 3 realized they were the only ones left standing inside the castle, their behavior in the market fundamentally changed. When an industry consolidates into a tight oligopoly, the surviving companies face a critical choice. They can continue to fight a bloody, highly expensive price war for every inch of market share, risking mutual destruction. Or they can realize that their mutual survival and ultimate profitability depend on keeping prices artificially high. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the market began to tighten, the DRAM manufacturers chose the latter. But they did it explicitly and illegally. Between 1998 and 2002, executives from Samsung, Hynix, Infineon, and Elpida engaged in a massive, coordinated, international price-fixing conspiracy. These executives held secret meetings in hotel rooms to share sensitive pricing data, coordinate production limits, and explicitly fix the prices of memory chips sold to major personal computer makers like Dell, HP, Apple, and Gateway. The cartel was ultimately busted when Micron, recognizing the legal peril, acted as a whistleblower and approached the United States Department of Justice in exchange for corporate immunity. The fallout from the investigation was historic. The European Commission slapped the colluding companies with over €331 million in fines. The US Department of Justice levied over $731 million in criminal penalties, which at the time were some of the largest antitrust fines in American history. Several high-ranking executives pleaded guilty and were sent to federal prison in the United States. The Big Three learned unequivocally that explicitly communicating to fix prices would land their executives in jail. But the underlying economics of their oligopoly had not changed. They still controlled the market. Therefore, they evolved. They quickly realized that they did not actually need secret backroom meetings or burner phones to control the global market. They just needed to closely watch each other, meticulously read each other's public financial reports, listen to quarterly earnings calls, and act in perfect, unspoken synchronization. In the academic realm of economics, this behavior is known as conscious parallelism. Firms in a highly concentrated oligopoly recognize their mutual interdependence and engage in strategic behavior without any formal collusion. But in the polite, highly sanitized corporate speak of the semiconductor industry, they call this practice supply discipline. To see exactly how supply discipline works in practice, we only have to look at the macroeconomic events of the last 2 years. In 2022 and early 2023, the global economy suffered a severe post-pandemic hangover. Smartphone sales plummeted. PC demand cratered. Suddenly, the world was awash in a massive oversupply of memory chips, and prices collapsed so violently that manufacturers were selling chips below the sheer cost of production. In a truly competitive free market, companies would fight tooth and nail to maintain their sales volume, driving prices even lower until the weakest firms went bankrupt. But the DRAM market is a highly disciplined oligopoly. They had already survived the brutal Hunger Games of the 1990s. So, instead of fighting, they all collectively stepped on the brakes. In 2023, SK Hynix and Micron publicly announced massive cuts to their wafer production. Shortly after, Samsung, a company historically known as the most aggressive player, did the exact same thing. They systematically and purposefully starved the market. SK Hynix announced it would slash its production of legacy DDR4 memory chips down to just 20% of its total manufacturing output. Samsung actively cut its NAND flash memory wafer production from 4.9 million down to 4.68 million. The strategy worked flawlessly. By universally restricting the supply of general-purpose memory, the Big Three artificially created a massive supply shortage. By the third quarter of 2025, overall DRAM contract prices were a staggering 171.8% higher than they were just a year prior. The wholesale price of standard DDR5 memory modules more than doubled. Now, there is a credible counter-argument presented by the companies themselves. They vehemently argue that the incredible price increases are purely the result of organic market forces and the sudden, overwhelming, unprecedented demand for artificial intelligence hardware. But this excuse acts as a convenient smokescreen. When an oligopoly controls 95% of the global capacity, they do not have to respond to the whims of the market. They are the market. And right now, these three companies are executing the most profitable strategic pivot in the history of Silicon Valley by essentially abandoning the everyday consumer. The explosive rise of generative AI models requires a staggering amount of computational power. Massive data centers are filled with extremely expensive AI processors, like NVIDIA's highly coveted GPUs. But these AI processors are so incredibly fast that standard memory chips physically cannot feed them data quickly enough, creating a severe architectural bottleneck known as the memory wall. To solve this fundamental physics problem, the industry utilizes a premium, highly specialized technology called high bandwidth memory, or HBM. Unlike standard DDR5 memory, which is packaged as a flat black rectangle, HBM literally builds skyscrapers of silicon. It stacks multiple ultra-thin DRAM dies vertically, one on top of the other. To connect these layers, microscopic vertical wires called through-silicon vias are drilled directly through the silicon dies. This intricate vertical architecture allows an HBM stack to deliver multiple terabytes per second of bandwidth directly into the GPU. But building skyscrapers of silicon comes with a massive, unavoidable manufacturing penalty. Because of the extreme physical complexity, the manufacturing yield is much lower, and the physical footprint of the memory cells is larger. According to leading industry analysts, Producing one single gigabyte of the latest HBM3E memory requires roughly 3 times the raw silicon wafer capacity as producing the exact same amount of standard, consumer-grade DDR5 memory. This creates the ultimate zero-sum game. The global capacity of hyper-pure silicon wafers and clean room space is strictly finite. Therefore, every single silicon wafer that Samsung, SK Hynix, or Micron allocates to build an HBM stack for an NVIDIA AI GPU is a wafer that is actively and permanently denied to a consumer laptop, a PlayStation gaming console, or a smartphone. And the profit margins on this AI hardware are absolutely astronomical. Because the hyperscalers like Microsoft, Google, and Meta are locked in an existential arms race to build AI data centers, they are willing to pay almost any price for the hardware. SK Hynix reportedly earns a staggering 70% operating margin on its high-bandwidth memory products. As a direct result, the Big Three have diverted almost all of their advanced capital expenditure and precious cleanroom space toward feeding the insatiable AI data centers, practically abandoning the lower-margin consumer electronics market to fend for itself. Consequently, your everyday gadgets are becoming the unrecognized casualties of the artificial intelligence war. Because the supply of general-purpose memory is so artificially scarce, its wholesale price is surging to unprecedented heights. Market analysts estimate that in 2026, the cost of the bill of materials, the raw physical components required to build a device, for low-end smartphones will increase by up to 25%, purely due to the surging cost of DRAM. Smartphone manufacturers, already operating on razor-thin margins, are being aggressively squeezed. To maintain their profitability, they are left with two highly unpopular choices. They can either raise the retail price of the phone, passing the tax directly onto you, or they can quietly downgrade the internal specifications, selling you a device with less memory than a phone from 3 years ago. In fact, the global shortage is so severe that global smartphone shipments are projected to shrink by 2.1% in 2026, simply because a massive swath of global consumers can no longer afford the inflated hardware. But even inside a cozy, highly disciplined 3-company cartel, there is intense, high-stakes corporate drama. The AI boom has completely upended the traditional hierarchy of the global tech world. For more than 3 decades, Samsung Electronics was the undisputed, untouchable, and seemingly invincible king of the global memory market. But in 2025, the unthinkable happened. SK Hynix, a company that just 2 decades prior was widely considered a failing zombie enterprise, surviving only on state-mandated creditor bailouts, officially dethroned Samsung. In the first half of 2025, SK Hynix captured 36.3% of the global DRAM market, beating Samsung for the first time since 1992. Even more shockingly, they surpassed Samsung in annual operating profit, posting a record-shattering $33.1 billion. SK Hynix placed an early, incredibly aggressive, and highly technical bet on advanced HBM packaging technology, allowing them to form an early, highly exclusive partnership with NVIDIA. In the first half of 2025 alone, a staggering 27% of SK Hynix's total global revenue came from just one single deep-pocketed client, NVIDIA. Samsung, meanwhile, stumbled catastrophically on the world stage. For 18 agonizing months, Samsung's advanced HBM3E memory chips repeatedly failed NVIDIA's incredibly strict qualification tests. The chips suffered from excessive heat generation and unacceptably high power consumption. While SK Hynix and the American manufacturer Micron confidently locked in massive multi-year supply contracts that guaranteed billions in revenue, Samsung was left entirely out in the cold. The engineering failure triggered a massive internal crisis at Samsung headquarters. In a highly unusual, deeply public move that shocked the South Korean business establishment, the newly appointed head of Samsung's semiconductor division, Jun Young-hyun, issued a formal letter of reflection and apology. In a scathing internal memo, Jun warned that Samsung had slowly developed a toxic, complacent corporate culture characterized by hiding or avoiding systemic problems rather than addressing them. So, what happens next in this highly concentrated market? Will the prices of standard computer memory ever come back down to historical norms? We can look at the future of the semiconductor industry through a decision tree of 3 highly distinct scenarios. In the base, and perhaps most likely scenario, the structural shift in the market is entirely permanent. Executives at both Micron and SK Hynix have publicly stated that their high-bandwidth memory manufacturing capacity is effectively sold out through the entirety of 2026. Almost all of their future capital expenditure is irrevocably tied up in building AI infrastructure. This means that general consumer DRAM will remain artificially constrained by design. Supply will stay tight, wholesale prices will remain structurally high, and you will inevitably pay a premium for everyday laptops, tablets, and smartphones for the next 2 to 3 years. In the worst-case scenario for the global economy, the massive artificial intelligence investment bubble eventually bursts. Hyperscalers stop buying GPUs, and demand for HBM evaporates. But the memory hardware manufacturers, addicted to their new margins, refuse to lower prices. Having learned exactly how effective their strategy was during the 2022 crash, they will utilize extreme, highly coordinated supply discipline to immediately halt production lines. They will aggressively protect their 70% profit margins while continuing to starve the consumer electronics market of affordable chips. Everyday gadgets will not only become drastically more expensive, but base models of phones and computers will actively regress, offering consumers less RAM than devices sold 3 or 4 years ago. But there is a best-case scenario for the everyday consumer, and it involves a massive geopolitical wildcard. A potential disruptor is currently looming on the horizon: China. Backed by hundreds of billions of dollars in direct state subsidies, Chinese domestic memory manufacturers, most notably a company called CXMT, are desperately attempting to break into the global memory market. If these Chinese firms can successfully navigate and bypass crippling United States export restrictions, acquire the necessary lithography equipment, and achieve high manufacturing yields, they could fundamentally alter the global supply curve. By operating outside the established cartel, they could flood the international market with cheap, legacy memory chips. While they may not compete on the bleeding edge of AI hardware, they could utterly break the cartel's iron grip on standard consumer DRAM. This influx of state-backed supply would force global prices down, finally bringing relief to the everyday electronics market. But until that happens, the illusion of choice remains. You may have 50 choices for the brand of your next smartphone, but as long as 3 companies control the silicon brain inside of it, they are the ones truly setting the price.